Thank you, Sir Gary, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful for the time today to raise what I think is a really important issue, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time between us to discuss some of the merits of it. Perhaps I won't keep you for all of it. But I wanted to start by setting the scene a little bit, why we're here and why I brought forward this debate on recruiting more male teachers into primary schools. Or indeed into teaching in general, Sir Gary, because we're short across the board. Now, having this debate this week, I think, is also important in the build-up to International Men's Day this weekend. And I'll touch on later the impact that all of this has on our young people, young boys, and their mental health and stability, which is really meaningful. I know, of course, there are many challenges facing our schools, not least the financial squeeze all organisations are feeling from inflation and rising costs. Don't get me started on our curriculum, on teacher recruitment and retention, and empowering teachers on Ofsted. I'm sure the Minister and I could debate those things all day. I'm sure that would be very enjoyable. But this is also important, and socially and culturally important, as I will lay out. I'll declare an interest first, because as it happens, before I accidentally became a politician, I had always planned to be a teacher and had myself considered teaching in primary schools. As it happens, I never quite got there before I fell into some local issues, bin-related drama, as it happens, wheelie bins. People get very passionate about wheelie bins. That led to me becoming a district councillor, and the rest is history. But despite not having ended up in teaching, children's welfare, primary education remain really important to me personally, not least because I've got primary age children myself. I've committed much of my time over the past 5 years in this place to policy that is in one way or another related to supporting children. Another issue that's really important to me, and I think to our society, is equality. I've been perhaps the most vocal critic, Mr. Chairman, Sir Gary, of our equalities legislation, which is almost always misused and misunderstood. The Equality Act of 2010 is often explained as protecting characteristics such as female, BME, LGBT, when in fact that's not the case. It protects biological sex, race, sexuality, among others, both male and female equally, white, black and anything else equally, gay or straight absolutely equally. It is, after all, the Equality Act. So the intention, indeed the law, Sir Gary, is that the exact same legislation that's cited in order to support young women into STEM subjects, for example, where they are historically underrepresented, young women to university, even though actually by today's figures they're overrepresented, but those schemes still exist, should also be used to support young men where they are underrepresented in professions such as nursing, for example, or indeed in primary teaching.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Oh, would you?
I thank my honourable friend, who is a great loss to teaching, but he does also have a great passion for sport, and it's on that particular point that I recently met with the PFA, who helped thousands of men and women transition from their footballing careers into other careers. Surely this is a big opportunity for the Department of Education to work with them, particularly to help in the thrust of this debate to get more males into primary schools.
Absolutely. Thank him for that intervention, which is really an important point to make. There are examples. We had a debate actually in this place only a few weeks ago about more flexible routes into teaching. That sounds like a brilliant one. We also touched on routes from early years education into primary teaching. If you are well able and qualified to teach and support 5-year-olds in an early years setting, why not 6-year-olds in a primary setting? Some of the barriers really do make it very difficult, but that sounds like a fantastic scheme that perhaps is an example of how some of that positive action under the Act could be used to benefit this issue. Because the law does exist, Sir Gary, to enable us to tackle this issue, one that I'll lay out for you in a second, but it's almost never interpreted in that way. And in a recent debate on access to teaching in this very room, the previous minister informed me that there are no schemes and no planned schemes which would support young men to get into primary teaching. Today, the real point of my speech and bringing this debate forward is quite simply to ask why, when we do have that opportunity, and when I'll lay out for you why this is a problem. So that's why we're here, and I think this matters. But what is that problem? I've got some figures for you that I think might surprise you, as it feels like it's gone under the radar a little bit. I know it's a conversation among parents outside the school gates, those with primary age children, because I am one, and I've had that conversation with a number of parents at my own children's school. But to a wider audience, these figures might surprise. So only 14% of primary and nursery teachers are male. 14%. Significantly less than 1 in 5. It's actually a slight rise from 12% in 2010. However, the total teaching workforce in general has become more female-dominated in that time, with more than 75% of teachers now female, up from 74% a decade ago. So in England's nearly 17,000 primary schools, there are 3,240 with no male teachers on the payroll whatsoever. Not one. An average of just under 300 pupils per school. That's potentially nearly a million children with no male role model in their education setting.
Will the honourable gentleman give way? Thank you for giving way. And I wanted to participate briefly in the debate because my daughter is in her second year of training for qualified teacher status, having done her PGCE, and I asked her whether she agreed with the premise of the honourable gentleman that there should be more men encouraged into what is largely a female workforce. She made the point that the honourable gentleman has very much just made, that there are many of our young people who are growing up without a male role model in their lives. And she points out it's really good for children to be able to see men in a caregiving role, which is essentially the role within a primary school. She's got one or two other observations, and I might share those with him at a later intervention.
I thank you for that intervention. That's exactly right. I think those education settings, surely above all, if we are striving to find services, public services that are representative of our community and society, surely our primary education should be at the very heart of trying to achieve that and to show and teach young people about relationships, about role models, about all those things that are hugely, hugely important. And I'd thank him for that. I'll come on to that in more detail. Interestingly, it's a particular problem where I live in my region in the East Midlands, where a study for the Institute for Social and Economic Research in May this year found nearly a third of all state-funded schools in the East Midlands across primary and secondary do not have a single male classroom teacher. That's the highest in the country. In London, that figure's 12.5%, which is still a lot of schools. But in the East Midlands, wow, it is 30% of schools that don't have a single male teacher, which means 1 in 3 children has no male role model in their classrooms anywhere, not even in the building, for them to go and seek out. But on top of this, not only are men less likely to become teachers in the first place, but men who do become teachers are far less likely to remain in the profession than their female counterparts. We've been unable to recruit and retain male teachers. I know that's a problem across the board with female teachers as well, but particularly with male teachers. And the stats I've just shared make that issue particularly clear. Now, lots of action has been taken across inequalities in teaching, lots of action, understandably and quite rightly, to get more women into leadership roles within education, for example, quite right. Lots of action to make teaching more racially diverse, and indeed the teaching population is more ethnically diverse than the country as a whole. As I said at the start, Sir Gary, these imbalances get tackled citing the Equality Act, and yet the fact that 1 in 3 children in my region have no male teacher in school at all, only 1 in 4 teachers are male, and even fewer in primary schools, just 14%. There are no schemes, and as the previous minister said, no planned schemes to try and balance this up under that same act, which is intended to support both male and female and to protect both male and female equally. It is not working, is it? It's not being used properly. So you might be asking, Sir Gary, you might think, all right, well, the figures are skewed. We can see that. There aren't many male primary teachers, not many blokes in the profession. Why does that matter? Well, I'll tell you why. And it touches on a point made by my honourable friend earlier on. Having male primary school teachers is really important for a number of societal, psychological and social reasons. First, male and female teachers contribute to children's gender knowledge in a balanced way. They contribute to their understanding at a very young age of what male and female are and mean, of what those roles might be. That may seem a small thing, but for an ever-increasing number of young people who don't have a male role model at home, who therefore very often don't have male role models that they can learn from and emulate in their personal lives, having them at school becomes ever more important. In an ever more difficult, often infuriating, I have to say, Sir Gary, society where sometimes our discussing gender can be incredibly unclear and, dare I say, incredibly misleading, certainly complicated by mixed and politically charged messages about what male is and what gender is, a simple, balanced interaction with male and female positive role models is really, really important. And in a time where sometimes masculinity or being a man can be portrayed very negatively and where young men increasingly find it hard to figure out what their role in life, what their role in our society might be, leading to all sorts of mental health problems, as I'm sure we'll discuss over the course of this week in the build-up to International Men's Day, having a consistent, respectable male role model in your life that you trust has perhaps never been more important. I would make the same case in support of things like youth work, for example, which can do so much for the relationships and trust and security of young people in our communities. For the most disadvantaged and vulnerable children, the presence of male teachers might be vital, allowing them to observe men who are non-violent, for example, whose interactions with women are respectful and positive. And this is particularly important for those children from dysfunctional backgrounds, households with domestic abuse, family environments that are not healthy. If the only consistent male figure in your life is actually a bad role model, is actually teaching bad behaviours, how are you to know or to learn any different? And today, some 2.5 million children grow up without dad at home. That has an impact. But much more than that, estimates from 2020 suggest some 30,000 or more children are exposed to domestic abuse at home every month, where the man in their life, in their home, sets a poor example, where relationships are dysfunctional. Male teachers, safe, trusted, respectable role models, are absolutely vital for those children. When I say children consistently, I'm saying children, not just boys, because I mean all children. The good male role models are not just important for boys, but also for girls for exactly the same reasons. They're equally important to understand how men and women treat each other or should treat each other, to have trusted adult males that they can rely on in their lives, to understand, as I've said, some of those issues around gender and roles and responsibilities, and to tackle the same problems of poor examples, poor role models, if they have them at home, and to show them a different path. It's a self-perpetuating cycle as well, Sir Gary, I think, that limited visibility of male teachers means men are less likely to go into teaching. Again, I draw the comparison with nursing. Stereotypes abound in that space. Primary teaching is a women's job. Men teach design, technology, and PE. Men are doctors, women are nurses. It's outdated and old-fashioned. It's absolute nonsense, of course. But there's still an outdated and ill-informed prevailing view that primary teachers are women. It shouldn't be the case, but when you look at the stats, it largely is the case. That view often means men don't apply. Once again, I may as well keep adding in nursing because it's a very similar challenge. There are areas where, or these are areas where the Equality Act is absolutely clear. Measures could and indeed should be taken to tackle a clear imbalance and a disparity between characteristics, where one group is massively underrepresented. That's precisely what the Act is here to tackle. And yet, we heard in this very room just a month or so ago, there are no schemes and there are no planned schemes to try. So quite simply, I asked the Minister today, why not? When we put so much energy and resource into teacher recruitment and retention, hugely important for our schools, why not? We are offering huge financial incentives for people to teach key subjects, but this is key too. A lack of male role models will have a negative effect on the lives of young people, leaving an increasing number of young men with mental health problems, unable to work out who they are, what their role in society is, leaving young women, young people with unhealthy views of what relationships with men should look like. I dare say, in my view, a lack of men in teaching is actually more important in society for its fabric, for its well-being of our young people, than a lack of maths teachers. But we are incentivising maths teachers. We're not incentivising male teachers and healthy relationships. Why? Is there a logical reason, or is it, as I suspect, and given what I've said about the Equality Act already, my experience of that is there's a deep-seated fear within parts of Whitehall that thinks if they use the Equality Act to do something that supports men, they're going to get slated on Twitter. It's probably true. When I've had these conversations and raised these points, I get slated on Twitter as well. But it's important to recognise, Sir Gary, that Twitter quite regularly spouts a load of nonsense. And we can't be governed by Twitter. I firmly believe that the wider public would be fully supportive of the premise of what I'm saying here today. We need more male teachers in primary schools and schools in general. I will give away.
He just made some very interesting points about the financial incentive. It's accepted, I think, that salaries and careers in secondary education generally are higher remunerated than in primary, and that doesn't provide an incentive for male teachers to go into primary, often where in a relationship they are seen as the main breadwinner. And whilst none of us would want a particular financial incentive for male teachers, the attractiveness of primary teaching is something that I really do think does need to be looked at.
I thank you for that. He's absolutely right about the wider recruitment and retention challenge as a whole in trying to get more people into teaching and primary teaching. As I touched on earlier, we debated some of those avenues that we might take to support more and a wider range of backgrounds and experiences through easier routes. My honourable friend earlier on mentioned that transition from coaching, for example, into teaching, or a transition from early years into teaching. There are different ways that we can support through schemes like that to incentivise male teachers. Perhaps the football example is a good one, where you can imagine lots of men in their 30s ending a career in sport, or who've been coaching and looking after young people in a coaching environment, could actually very easily transition into teaching type roles. I will get.
It goes even further than that, because the majority of those will be aged between 18 and 24 because they haven't quite fulfilled their dream of Premier League stardomship. And the PFA are desperate to sit down with the Department of Education to talk about this. They're already working with DCMS, so I hope my honourable friend will join me in encouraging the Minister to sit down with the PFA.
Thank him for that, and I absolutely will support that. I'd love to have that conversation. I think it's a prime example of the kind of scheme supported by the Equality Act and everything I've described. It's exactly the right thing that we could do and should do to try and incentivise a massively male-dominated space where people could transition into teaching. A perfect example, and I thank you for bringing it to us today, of what I am talking about. So what can the Minister do, aside from set up that conversation, which will be really helpful, to ensure the importance of this is recognised, that barriers are removed, that the tools we use to tackle these inequalities in other areas are also used for this? All the data, the anecdotal evidence, the common sense should tell us that this is really important, and I hope that can be recognised in policy. I thank colleagues for engaging in today's debate, and I look forward to the Minister's response.